Hello, my name is Madeline Carr. Tonight, I am introducing a program called The Bells of WAKULLA Spring. It's a joint presentation to the Tallahassee Historical Society and the Friends of WAKULLA Springs State Park. We all, myself included, do know how cold the spring water is, and so I wonder how this group of bells here standing on top of this still existing WAKULLA Springs sign, swam for this scene. Take notice of the round object in this movie next to the platform. That is the other bell of WAKULLA Spring. So there are innovations and circumstances that present opportunities. In this case, shivers and joy that are the consequence of this round object that you just saw. I begin with, and I hope you'll agree, with an honorary bell called Nellie Bly. Nellie Bly might never have heard of WAKULLA Springs, but the fun and underwater innovations might never have happened if she hadn't been part of the progressive era. She challenged Jules Verne, who in 1873 wrote about traveling around the world in 80 days. She was born Elizabeth Jane Cochran. Her nom de plume that she got when she joined the very early female reporter at the New York World that hired her in 1887. By age 25, she was a world famous journalist. She married industrialist Robert Seaman in 1894, who was the owner of the ironclad manufacturing company that made enameled kitchenware. Actually, Nellie Bly deserves a program all to herself. In fact, there was a movie made in 2019 called Escaping the Madhouse, about part of her life. Let me tell you some about Nellie Bly, some more Nellie Bly snippets. In 1888, Bly suggested to her editor at the New York World that she take a trip around the world, attempting to turn the fictional Around the World in 80 Days into the fact for the first time. And a year later, at 9:40 in the morning on November the 14th, 1889, and with 2 days' notice, she boarded the Augusta Victoria, a steamer of the Hamburg America line, and began her 40,070-kilometer journey. She took with her the dress she was wearing, a sturdy overcoat, several changes of underwear, and a small travel bag carrying her toiletry essentials. She carried most of her money, 200 pounds in English banknotes and gold, as well as some American currency in a bag tied around her neck. The availability of modern technology brought her travels to her readers. By then, the development of efficient submarine cable networks and the electric telegraph allowed Bly to send short programs and progress reports, although longer dispatches had to travel by regular post and thus were often delayed by several weeks. She became a sensation as flyers promoted her adventures, such as this one, bidding goodbye to Phineas Fogg, Jules Verne's protagonist in 80 Days. "Oh, Fogg, goodbye," said Nellie Bly. "It takes a maiden to be spry, to span the space twixt thought and act, and turn a fiction into fact." She was 31 in 1895 when she married industrialist Robert Seaman, then 73 years old. And she took another trip, this time to Austria. And one might say this was a reconnaissance voyage to a European competitor to see how steel cans were constructed and sealed. Back at the ironclad manufacturing company that she now owned after her husband's death, she saw firsthand how she could contribute to the profits. She patented a milk can and stacking garbage can. I am, said Bly, the only manufacturer in the country who can produce a certain type of steel barrel for which there is an immense demand at present for the transportation of oil, gasoline, and other liquids. She was the woman of the industrial age. In 1981, at the Pan American Exposition, she was promoted as being the only woman in the world managing industries of such magnitude. Sadly, the ironclad manufacturing company went bankrupt. Bly returned to reporting and went to Europe during World War I. She was mistaken as a British spy in the war zone between Serbia and Austria and was arrested. Remnants of that era can be found in landfills nowadays, where the steel barrel that was the model for the 55-gallon oil drum are carelessly dumped. But you are justified in scratching your head if you're wondering why I'm talking about this honorary belle called Nellie Bly. A few years ago, the Friends of WAKULLA Springs State Park received a conservation grant from the Florida Division of Historic Preservation. We were to protect 20th century artifacts that were strewn all over the park. It included this. It is a very, very large object. The park staff told me this was the diving bell. The conservation project was completed and we began taking pictures. My husband Palmer spotted this in the round circle at the bottom of the screen, and I took another look. I actually was very excited when I saw all the patent numbers on there, because I knew that I could find out who got the patent and when. I discovered a young, adventurous woman called Nellie Bly. The only woman in the world personally managing industrial objects of such magnitude. The invention of a metal barrel plug, such as this one, successfully provided a seal for barrels that transported oil. The old wooden barrels had been leaky, unworthy of this industrial era necessity. Nellie Bly to the rescue. And indeed, without her, this would never have been possible. The diving bell, as I still call it, although it's really known as the hole in the water, is on display at the state park near the administration building, along with the other 20th century artifacts. The mechanical wonder was put into action to shoot underwater scenes in the WAKULLA River. It was the invention of Max Knoll, a mechanical engineer and holder of the world's deep diving record. Max Knoll built this metal and glass floating underwater film chamber. In this drawing, you can see a cross-section of this diving bell or hole in the water. The bricks at the bottom of the diving bell made sure it didn't just pop up onto the surface of the water. And on the left-hand side or the right-hand side, as you might be looking at this, you'll see Max Knoll actually envisioned having a little motor there to move it through the water. That didn't work too well, but the cameraman was able to enter into this chamber and look through the windows at the crystal clear water to film whatever was going on down there. As an aside, a much larger diving bell, a huge one actually, and it was a different contraption altogether. It wasn't constructed to film underwater scenes. It was constructed to lower people into Silver Springs to take a look around. More than 20 people at a time could be lowered into the water at Silver Springs to see that view at the time. It was the beginning of a collaboration between Newt Perry and Max Knoll and Grantland Rice. The decade of the 1930s was the beginning of romance with underwater scenes. In the 1930s, Ted Husing, the star narrator and producer Jack Eaton, started collaborating on dozens of films. 1933 seems to be Husing's first contribution to the Grantland Rice Spotlight Pictures. It was filmed in the Everglades, and apparently it was about catching a bear. But Ted Husing was a famous sportscaster on radio, starring as himself in many of these film productions. But who was Max Knoll, and what was he doing at WAKULLA Springs? My guess is that Newt Perry and Max Knoll were destined to cross paths. It's a classic combination of circumstances presenting opportunities. Newt Perry was a couple of years older than Max Knoll, a South Georgia boy born in 1908, whose family moved to Ocala in Florida in 1922. A year later, he was a lifeguard at Silver Spring. As a member of the swimming and diving teams at the University of Florida, graduating with a degree in education, he also earned the nickname, the Human Fish, for his performances of underwater stunts in advertising clips. Max Knoll, on the contrary, was born way up north in Milwaukee in 1910. He died short of his 50th birthday in a fiery car crash, and according to his obituary in the Milwaukee Journal, Knoll's fascination with diving began at an early age. He was a student at MIT and invented a self-contained diving suit. Knoll found his suit to be a drag when he used it to explore Wisconsin lakes. It is written that scuba was Knoll's invention that was used in 1938 in a Caribbean expedition where he dove to look for sunken treasure. No luck, there was no treasure. But it was also a year after he had he dove in Lake Michigan, setting the world diving record at 420 feet. 1937 was a consequential year for WAKULLA Spring. Nothing would ever be as it was, as this building called the Lodge in a former swamp opened to the public. It was also the year Ed Ball hired Newt Perry as manager. Perry moved from to WAKULLA Spring from Silver Springs and lived at the Lodge at a very short time before moving into the apartment at the staff house, which is today's administration building. By now, his sister, Martha Dent Perry, was a student at the Florida State College for Women, and she too was enamored with water as part of the college tarpon club of synchronized swimmers. I think it was the first holiday after the Lodge opened in 1937 that provided visitors with a special waterfront show put on by the Tarpon Club. Later, when a film crew showed up at the old Montgomery gym at FSU, it was too dark to showcase the synchronized swimmers, and Martha put the idea of inviting the film crew to WAKULLA Spring to her brother, Max Knoll. Max Knoll and Newt Perry were ready to give Hollywood a fling. Between 1938 and 1940, Perry hired Max Knoll to set up underwater props at WAKULLA Spring. They all collaborated on the earlier Tarzan movies shot at Silver Spring before coming to WAKULLA Spring. But for the 1941 Tarzan's Secret Treasure for MGM, construction of underwater props and breathing equipment went into high gear, as you can see from this drawing that Max Knoll presented, to have underwater breathing stations for divers who could duck into these stations with their heads above water and catch a breath of fresh air. Here's Newt Perry before coming to WAKULLA Springs. So the hole in the water was critical, and other contraptions were most likely built in the area. The hole in the water was huge. It was manufactured in Milwaukee, and it was transported down the Ohio and the Mississippi River before coming overland across to St. Mark's and then up the WAKULLA River. The underwater breathing chambers were spaced in a way that allowed face mask diving only. The swimmer entered the chamber where air was available above the water's surface. Before coming to WAKULLA, Perry worked at Silver Spring for the first Tarzan productions. He developed an underwater breathing technique using an air hose and a compressor. If you've seen the mermaids at Weeki Wachee, this is how they stay submerged for minutes. Meanwhile, here at WAKULLA Spring in 1940, preparations were made to construct a 3-tier tower for the next production, that third of the Tarzan series called Tarzan's Secret Treasures. Having participated in dozens of public events here at the park, I just cannot imagine what it was like to have an elephant, chimpanzee, monkeys, and of course, Jane Seymour as Tarzan's helper, and the film crew, their grips, cameramen and women running around. How exciting it must have been. By the way, Maureen O'Sullivan was Jane, but she had a double for her scenes shot here at WAKULLA Spring, none other than Newt Perry's sister, Martha. Coming through the woods today, right parallel to the river itself, there is a road called the River Drive, and you can see all of the animals being transported upriver. The elephant, by the way, had to be pushed into the water. I didn't really want to show him being shoved in, so you can see him coming back out. Newt Perry is to the left for this production of Tarzan. But equally thrilling for me was the discovery at the Wisconsin Historical Society of part of Max Knoll's manuscript for a book, a memoir of sorts. I'd like to read you a couple of excerpts. This one has to do with the high dive. Here's Johnny Weissmuller and his graceful jump from the 4th tier of that tower that the film company built at the time. This is from Moll's manuscript, and it's really hard for anyone today to imagine what it must have been like. Quote, "After we completed the huge structure, we were amazed to discover the curious illusion created by the crystal clear water. The prospective diver, standing on the top platform, if he dared to look down before he dove, was chagrined to find that instead of a 60-foot drop to the surface of the water, there appeared to be a 100-foot span to a jagged rock bottom, the water being so clear that it could not be seen. On some of these first dives, there was disaster waiting, the water being so transparent that it was impossible for the diver to tell when it was time to straighten out. Knoll wrote that they finally arranged to ruffle the water so the surface could be seen for a would-be birdman. But my favorite passage has to do with the glass house seen behind the round object in this picture here. The round object being pointed out by the yellow arrow is that diving bell or the hole in the water, and people would be ferried up there by boat, let out, and they could go down into the diving bell to take a look around. But the glass house really was anchored to the dock in the back of this image. Try and imagine the land of sunshine in the winter. It was discovered that it could be cold. While the water temperature was always the same, 68 to 71 degrees, winter or summer swimming conditions were the same for filming, but it was going in and coming out that was so painful. Anyone here agree? This house was built entirely of flexible glass. It was always warm as an oven. The winter sun poured through the transparent roof and made it like a Turkish bath within. The prospective mermaid would enter the house in her fur coat and adjourn to the dressing room, the only part that was not transparent, to slip into her bathing suit. She would then, in Santa Claus fashion, step into the fireplace to enter her special domain, a ladder leading down into the water. Ducking under the submerged edge, she would instantly find herself free in the great spring. And when she was finished with her swim or submarine performance, she merely had to reverse the procedure, returning up into the fireplace to enter the warm house without ever exposing her body to the cold air. In 1943, the Academy Award for Short Best Documentary was given for a movie called Amphibious Fighters. Many of you have seen this training film, but here's a clip showing the hole in the water. I call it hole in the fire. I think it's important to realize that the people who were training at the WAKULLA Spring had to actually swim through these scenes of smoke, and they had to film and swim through the fire that was lit on top of WAKULLA Springs. One can just imagine with, the anxiety as the fire got closer and closer and closer to the hole in the water. The film depicts the Camp Gordon Johnson Amphibious Training Center, the camp where thousands of soldiers were trained for deployment in World War II. The camp was located on hundreds of thousands of acres west of here in Franklin County, and exhibits about the popular Camp Gordon Johnson experience are displayed at the museum near Carabel Beach. Johnny Weissmuller swung through the imaginary Africa at WAKULLA Springs. He stayed at WAKULLA Lodge and apparently enjoyed flirting with the local girls. When he stuck his head out of his room window and shouted his famous Tarzan yell, the kitchen staff knew it was time for breakfast. Newt Perry is most famously remembered for his underwater exploits. And here he's seen, instead of the little motor pushing the hole in the water, it was actually a human being pushing for cinematographer Russ Irving through the spring before they got to the location that they wanted to anchor. The one on the left, I'm not so sure, but I think it's a compressor on top of that hole in the water. But Newt Perry is also most often remembered for his performance as a swim double for Johnny Weissmuller. And few recall that it was Perry that helped popularize Ed Ball's Park and Lodge before and during World War II. He served as a stuntman, swimming coach, and casting director for many, many extras. In the view of him inside the diving bell, I think is really interesting. So the diving bell, you can actually look out of the windows if you go to the display at the park now. All the other little extra stunts that were pulled off at WAKULLA Springs were filmed not only from the diving bell, but also from a pedal car that looked like a regular car, and a boat that was shaped like an alligator. And Newt Perry is standing here on top of the hole in the water, directing the synchronized swimmers in the background. Perry had met a mermaid, his own mermaid, a synchronized swimmer training for the 1948 Olympics in Miami, and he fell in love. Dot Roederer trained with the famous Water Follies and had her own water ballet team that performed with Esther Williams at Cypress Gardens. Dot and Newt were married in 1951. Creating the Wiki Watchy Mermaid show in the early 50s was possible with Perry's underwater breathing hoses, and he developed that attraction and its famous mermaids. He returned to his home in Ocala and there started the Perry Swimming School, which still continues today. Footage from the underwater scenes, shot from the hole in the water, mostly by Russ Irving as the cinematographer, were also used in many other movies, with production never actually happening at WAKULLA Springs. Instead, they used stock footage. Historian Tracy Revels included a chapter about movies in her book, Upon the Face of the Waters, A Brief History of WAKULLA Springs. As I said, some movies attributed to WAKULLA Springs might only have used stock footage. But prior to Tarzan in 1937, they shot a short nonfiction documentary about a mythical underwater picnic called Shooting Mermaids. We're hoping to get a copy of that pretty soon because we located it in the UCLA Film Library, and the Wisconsin Historical Society is working on cleaning it up and digitizing it. We might get a copy, and once it's been cleaned up and transmitted to us, we'll put it up on the Friends website. That was followed by Tarzan's Secret Treasure, and then the Amphibious Fighters that won the Academy Award. But in 1950, there was also a WAKULLA Spring promotion film called Fountain of Youth. And it was followed in 52 by Creature from the Black Lagoon, which happened to be the first 3D movie ever shot. And then Around the World in Under the Sea, where Newt Perry stunted for Lloyd Bridges. Many remember the largest underwater prop that was lowered to rest on the ledge at WAKULLA Springs. And it was a mock-up of a 747 jet fuselage and a wing that was the setting for the disaster movie starring Jack Lemmon called Airport 77. When Lemmon came to the spring from his hotel in Tallahassee, he didn't want to stay out in the sticks in Wakulla County. He watched local divers assist and then help him into the water in his wetsuit. The strong current prompted Lemmon to quote, "This was the hardest I've ever worked on a movie. I told him when we started, I'm a lover, not an athlete." No credit was given to the clear waters of Wakulla Spring. And by now it was becoming evident that the water was turning dark more often. Locals had a shot at watching Rico Browning direct underwater shots for Joe Panther. The short sequences dealt with an underwater rescue. But synchronized swimming, also known as water ballet, had a great history of its own. But after Newt Perry moved on to Weeki Wachee, synchronized performances also vanished. Miss Wakulla Springs in 1946 is almost forgotten. So she's another one of the belles at Wakulla Springs. And Max Knoll forever immortalized the glass-bottom boat when he looked up and provided us with this really nice, cute little drawing of people looking down on him as he was orchestrating the scenes underwater. So I've come to the end of the bells. One final look up at the glass-bottom boat, and who can tell me whether we should actually make Nellie Bly an honorary belle or not? And what were the two largest sounds ever recorded at Wakulla Springs? And who remembers this? So thank you for supporting the Friends of Wakulla Springs State Park and the Tallahassee Historical Society. And a very special thank you to the Florida Memory Project at the Department of State. A lot of the clips that you saw here came directly from their archives, the photo archives, or you can go to floridamemory.org and see them for yourselves. But I just wanted to leave you with these two last sounds that we just never hear again. The limpkin, And of course, this. Thank you.